Hey guys, my name is Michael Bishop and I'm a student in EDM 310 at the University of South Alabama. Of course, most of y'all already know this because you're listening to this podcast. I was assigned the book Lighting Their Fires by Rafa Squeeth. It's quite a good book, actually, even though I only was assigned 3 chapters. I ended up reading the whole thing and quite an eye opener into what we can do to help children, especially from the inner city, continue to want an education and break the chain of drugs and violence that plagues many of these schools. I've seen it firsthand. I went to elementary school in inner city Atlanta where it was quite prevalent, and many of the things that Mr. Esquith talks about, I've seen myself. The first chapter I was assigned to discuss in this podcast was the pregame show. Basically revolves around Mr. Squeeth and room 56 at Hobart Elementary School. Some of his students have the opportunity to attend a Dodgers baseball game with him on a particular Friday evening, and he talks about how those tickets came about and how he ended up selecting these students to go. They were members of a Shakespeare club that actually met after school with him and rehearsed lines and rehearsed different plays and discussed overall the Shakespearean life. Um, he talks quite a bit about a particular student named Sammy, who unfortunately at this point in time was not able to go to the game because he only had 6 tickets. He'd only take 5 students with him, and Sammy was the sixth member. He talks about how Sammy was a filthy child and he had unwashed clothes, but since he had gotten involved with the Shakespeare Club and made friends, he had cleaned himself up, and he had become quite interested in things such as history and the history of war. The pregame show ends up following Mr. Squeeth and his group of 5 students to Dodgers headquarters, where they're given a tour by a tour guide. Mr. Squeeth describes the tour guide as someone who just was used to her job and was expecting this tour to be like any other, where kids really aren't interested, they're not really paying attention, they just don't really care. She's quite surprised when one of the students notices a picture on the wall of someone who happened to be a huge Dodger fan. The picture was of Henry Fonda, and the woman is shocked to know that these students know who he is. I'm shocked to know that these students know who he is. Um, Mr. Squeets describes that several heads poked out of offices, and the tour guide continues, and at the end of it, the tour guide tells Mr. Squeeth just what an amazing group of students he actually has. She talks about how wonderfully they behave, and just that they're extraordinary. He says the secret is, though, is that they weren't born that way, that they became extraordinary. And he talks about that this is the central theme of the book, that we can continue to cultivate the qualities so that our students will have the drive and character necessary to take those natural gifts that they were given and just make extraordinary results out of them. He talks about how a lot of what he gives here is just suggestions, but that suggestions can sometimes be helpful. He says in the end, his greatest fear is not that his drugs or gangs. His fear is that the children will be mediocre and that they won't live up to the tremendous promise that they've all been given. He doesn't want them to be mediocre because he knows they are capable of more. The next chapter that I was assigned was the fourth inning, Crossroads. He starts it off by saying it's not overly dramatic to use the word crucial in emphasizing the importance of teaching children about making smart decisions. Even if they make good use of time and have focus, poor choices can instantly take away all the outstanding prospects that their other fine qualities afford them. He uses President Clinton as an example, talks about how he made a terrible decision to become sexually involved with a White House aide. He says that we are all human and we all make mistakes, but that in the end, one bad decision can ruin all the good that you've done. The chapter, of course, called The Fourth Inning, is about the fourth inning of the baseball game at Dodger Stadium that night. He talks about how the row behind him had just been occupied by four people who were using extremely profane language. They were loud, and they talked with what Mr. Asquith described as colorful metaphors. Not only was it from behind him, it was also from in front of him. There was a young child sitting in front of him who had become whiny because he was playing a game and the batteries had died. To fix the problem, the men decided to buy him a toy. They decided to buy him a Dodger flag with a 2 foot long wooden stick attached to it. In the middle of the fourth inning, Mr. Asquith describes a confrontation with the group of men in front of him after the young boy had continually used his flag to sling it back and forth and strike Mr. Asquith and the kids that he had with him. He uses a quote from President Teddy Roosevelt that says, "In a moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing, the next best is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing." He decides to simply talk to the men in front of him in hopes that maybe they could take the flag from the child and the students could enjoy the rest of the game. If you've ever been to a professional baseball game, you know that probably didn't turn out too well. The man uses quite a bit of profanity in discussing why he's just a kid and the kid needs to have his toy. All the fans, of course, are watching and waiting to see what's going to happen. He ends up losing the argument, and even in the bottom of the fourth inning, the men intentionally stand up and talk to one another to block the view of the children. In the end, the incident did shake the kids up a bit, but you know, kids, they're resilient and they found a way through it. Mr. Asquith uses this and another story that I'm about to describe to teach his children the unpleasant realities of decision making. Actions have consequences, and those outcomes are not always pretty. Sometimes, in studies in real life, you have to examine decisions made by others that have led to the awful results that you don't want to repeat. The purpose is not actually to judge anybody or anything. It's to teach you what decisions to make. And he even describes that just because they've made a bad decision that has brought harm upon themselves or others, that children shouldn't be encouraged to throw stones at that. They need to see, as painful as it may be to do so, that some choices affect us forever. And that some of those choices actually have consequences that we can't undo. He discusses two students. One is Linda. Linda, her mother was an illegal alien, and they lived in a 2 bedroom apartment. Unfortunately, there was another family in one room, and Linda and her family in another room of this 2 bedroom apartment. It was a fatherless home, and Linda ended up working in room 56 with Mr. Asquith when she was in elementary school, and now in high school she's earned extremely good grades and brought herself up from where she was. The other student is described as Karen. Karen was naturally beautiful, and while from a single parent household, her mother did hold a decent job, and they had a good apartment or house, and she had plenty of attention, plenty of guidance, and what decisions to make from her mom. Mr. Asquith describes that once middle school hit, she did start making poor decisions, and that by age of 15, she had become pregnant and had a child. He discusses some statistics of how most children under the age of 18, once they have a child, are less likely to graduate from high school, and the child is more likely to grow up in poverty and not graduate high school either. He discusses that she did make a bad decision and that has harmed her in some ways, but that she can still bring herself back from that decision. But she does have to live with the consequences of it. In the final chapter I was assigned, entitled Post Game Show, Mr. Asquith discusses his driving the students home and dropping them off, and he says he's left some papers behind at the school, so he's got to go get them. Of course, being in inner city Los Angeles, the school is locked up tight. There's 16-foot gates outside and armed security patrols it. He ascends the stairs up to his room um, to find out that Sam is actually still at the school. His mother never came for him, and no one could help him. When Mr. Squeeth asks him why he didn't try to get any more help, it says he figured he'd be back and that he'd just been reading. Sam had been reading the last 6 hours about the World War II campaigns of Patton and Montgomery. Mr. Squeeth ends up giving Sam a ride home that night and asks if he can take him to the downtown library on Monday because it was a holiday weekend. Mr. Squeeth asks why doesn't he just go to the library near his home, and Sam said, I've read everything they have. The downtown one is better. He also asks if he can take him to a military cemetery and place flags on the graves of the fallen soldiers. In closing, definitely something I learned from Mr. Squeeth is that as a teacher, I have to be willing to teach my children that everyone's going to make a bad decision. I am, they are, their parents are, friends and family members are, superstars, and even the President of the United States can make a bad decision. But it's teaching them how to rebound from that decision and how to stand strong in the face of adversity that can help our students get out of dire situations and situations that aren't going to be good for them, for the well-being of their families, and for the well-being of their careers and future education. We need to teach students that just because they've made that one bad decision doesn't mean their life is ruined, doesn't mean their life is over. They can still rebound from it, make changes in their life, and become the person that we as teachers know they can be. I like the quote he uses where he says he's not scared of drugs and gangs taking over his students. It's the fact that his students will be mediocre and not live up to the full potential they have. Thank you for listening.